Hello class, welcome to HC305, History 1, Apostles to Reformation. In this video, I'll be giving you a brief overview of what we are doing this semester. We'll look a little bit at history as a field and a discussion on primary and secondary sources. So let's get started. What are we doing this semester? We will be looking at the early church. How early Christians lived. Spoiler alert, we'll be talking about martyrs, especially in the early weeks. We'll be looking at expansion of the faith. This class is not just about Catholicism. We'll learn a lot about different ancient churches in different parts of the world. We'll be looking at early texts. Why did some things make it into the New Testament and others didn't? What was the early church like? What other early Christian texts have been influential, even if they didn't make it into the biblical canon? We will be looking at various theologians, saints, martyrs. We'll be looking at people who were condemned as heretics, and we'll explore those ideas and why they were rejected by the early church. We'll be looking at the councils, monasticism, and waves of spiritual and intellectual developments and renewal. The rise of Islam and subsequent challenges like losses of territory, armed conflict with Islamic states. We will be looking at Christian renewal movements, especially in the high to late Middle Ages, and looking at kind of spiritual and intellectual leaders in that time. And we'll finish up the semester looking at some proto-reformers, all right, leading into the Reformation, which of course is in history too. So in other words, we are looking at 1,500 years of global history in 10 weeks. It is a lot of content, but it is a survey course, all right? We are not going super in-depth on anything really. You'll have an opportunity in some of your projects to go a little deeper, but this is an opportunity to get a broad overview of the church from the beginning to the Reformation, okay? So here's a question I always get. Why do you have to take this class? All right, some people are pretty jazzed about taking history and some people are not. So here are some reasons that I have, and I think you'll agree by the end of the semester, I think you'll be glad you've taken this class. The first and foremost, and this has to be said at a Lutheran institution particularly, the church didn't begin in the year 1517. Don't tell your Reformation professors that, okay? We are part of a community of believers that spans back 2,000 years, all right? So we come out of a religious tradition, whether we like that or not, and we are influenced by these traditions, okay? There is no new thing under the sun, favorite Bible passage. Many of the challenges we face today have been dealt with before, okay? And we can learn things from people who have dealt with problems before us. There are really inspiring and beautiful writings and stories from the early church. And then there's things that we don't want to repeat. There are lessons we can learn from the past so we don't repeat them. And then very practically here, as a pastor, you will get questions about the history of Christianity. After this class, you should either be able to answer those questions right away or be able to go and find those answers, okay? So this is actually, there's a lot of practical information for ministry too, okay? These are things people are interested in. So how to be successful this semester, because usually the history classes, they are a little bit heavier content-wise, and we have a decent reading load. I will freely admit that, all right? So try to keep up with the readings. If you do fall behind, I would skip ahead and keep with the class and try to go back later instead of being continuously behind, okay? Do the assigned work, all right? Watch the videos, participate in Moodle post. If you want to, you can come to the optional meetups on Zoom. A lot of times students find that helpful to kind of talk through ideas, ask questions. I'll be there to answer lots of questions and things like that. If you need anything, don't hesitate to come and talk to me. All right, if I don't know what's going on, I can't help. I have regular office hours. They're posted online. I have Zoom and in-person office hours. And then remember, we have lots of resources available to you on campus as well. All right, so let's kind of transition over to sort of a broad topic of what is history. Okay. In general, I open all my classes with some sort of examination of method. I think it helps students to think about how we understand and how we create history, and the information on the types of sources you will need for your essays in the class and things like that. So, what is history? It's a surprisingly difficult thing to answer. If you kind of look up a dictionary definition of history, it'll say a study of past events, particularly in human affairs. It's very basic, and in that very basic way, it's true. But history is not simply facts about the past, okay? There's a lot of interpretation involved. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but I want to turn to a related question that I think helps answer this larger, like, what is history question in general. Okay, and my question is, how do we know something happened? Okay, what happened on December 7th, 1941? It was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I'm using this example because it's a modern event that has a ton of physical evidence, okay? There is no question that it happened. How do we know this? As historians, if we want to tell a story from history, we look for evidence. So in the case of Pearl Harbor, this picture that I have is evidence. So there are pictures, there are newsreels, there are newspaper accounts detailing this event. There are destroyed ships in the water. Okay, all of these things are evidence. There are personal accounts from people who witnessed it. Proving an event like this is really, really easy. It's recent as far as historians are concerned, and there's a lot of physical evidence that it actually happened. The further we go back, typically the more difficult it is to prove something. So another date. May 29th, 1453. If we were in class, I'd ask you, what happened that date? But I'll just tell you, it was the fall of Constantinople, okay? How do we know this? Again, this is a really, really big event. We'll talk about it later in the semester in greater detail, but there's a lot of evidence. There were stories of fleeing refugees from the city. There's a lot of paperwork. The city changed to Istanbul. It got new governance. There's a lot of physical damage done during the invasion. Again, we have physical evidence of this. However, the further back, the harder this is. Real early church stuff can be much harder to disentangle fact and fiction. And I'll mention this when we get to certain historical figures where it's like, here's some facts, here's some things that may be myth. I don't know, all right? Sometimes you have to be comfortable with uncertainty, okay? Now, I've talked a lot about evidence and documentation, which becomes very, very prominent, especially starting in the 19th century. And this became the standard way to do history. So, as historians, we need some sort of evidence to back up our claim. There are benefits, but there are also pitfalls to this, okay? Some of the benefits is that we have some basis for our claim. We can't just completely make stuff up. But the downside is that what about cultures that are oral cultures? They tend to be underrepresented in history. What about people who don't have access to the written word? Some of you have, I'm sure, heard the phrase, history is written by the winners. I actually don't like this phrase. I think it's overly simplistic. I would say history isn't so much written by the winners, but by those who left the most paperwork. Okay, kings and queens leave more paperwork than peasants. So do generals, so do scholars. Okay, so people who are highly educated in positions of power typically leave more documentation. And I can talk more about that at a different time, or if you want to chat about it, it's a really huge topic. Okay. So that is just something to keep in mind. So if you think about history in general then, okay, history tells us about the past, but also the present. Because there is so much interpretation and culture changes pretty rapidly, history books can become outdated much quicker than you might assume. Okay. When I write a history book or a history article, I have my own agendas and biases in it. We all do. When we read history, we also have all that stuff with us. All right. So one of the reasons that I have you read primary source documents is to kind of try to remove a layer of interpretation. Of course, the fact that like I pick what you read, there's a level of interpretation in that, but so I have to pick your readings. I'm your professor, okay, for the most part, though I do give you some real leeway in some of your assignments. Okay, so final topic, and then I'll be done with this video. Sources. Up on the screen, I have a list of example primary sources and secondary sources. I will also have this list on the Moodle page, okay? But you can see here, primary sources are immediate firsthand accounts of a topic, law texts, newspapers, speeches, diaries, original research, data, okay, things like that. These are great because there is not, you don't have that level of interpretation, all right? You don't have somebody else sorting through and telling you what's there. You can go there and look at it yourself. Okay, so the Coakley and Stirk book is a compilation of primary source documents. Students usually really enjoy digging into this book. Okay, secondary sources are one step removed from these primary sources, though they'll often quote from primary sources and they use the primary sources to write this. Okay, they can cover the same topics, but they add a layer of interpretation and analysis. Okay, so secondary sources include, most books about a topic, analysis or interpretation of data, scholarly articles, especially by people not directly involved in the events. Documentaries are secondary. The thing about secondary sources are, yes, they have that level of interpretation, which can actually be really beneficial. And the other nice thing about them is they are generally more interesting to read. We tend to be kind of storied people who like narratives, and that is what a secondary history book will give you. Okay, so that's why kind of the bulk of your reading is coming from these secondary sources with Gonzalez and Irving and Sundquist, and then we supplement with these primary source documents. All right, that is where I'm going to wrap this video up. In the next one, we will just dive right into content on the early church. All right, thanks everybody.